Roy, it's a real pleasure for me to see you again. It's been a number of years since
Quite a few.
we've been in touch.
Yes.
And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to get together. And I just want you to know how proud we are of all of the things you've done, Roy, over the times that I knew you as a student for a Ph.D. degree in pharmacology. You've done so many wonderful things in so many different areas. But what I'd like to get at is issues related to what has turned you on in your life in terms of jobs, science, education, and all the wonderful and commercial interactions, because in all these areas, you have really been at the top of the pile, so to speak, in terms of what you've done.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Domino.
Call me Ed, you know that. Roy,
Ed.
This is
Okay.
a Roy and Ed interaction, that's all.
Certainly. I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation to come here and for all of the impact that you've had on my life from the very first time that I walked into your laboratory. In fact, it was very fortuitous that I even knew there was such a thing as pharmacology, because when I first came to the university in 1955, I had no idea that there was such a subject as pharmacology. I was a graduate student in zoology, and just happened in a genetics class, a young lady by the name of Joan Hawkins, who was then a technician in your lab, said you needed somebody. So I came over, and right away you interviewed me, and next thing I know, I'm working in the laboratory and learning from you, and started to do the kind of research in pharmacology that I had hoped to be doing right away in zoology. But that didn't occur, but I did there.
Well, one of the things that I should tell you is what an enormous impact you've had on my life. One of the first interactions I had with you is when I met you. And at that first discussion, I'll never forget you as long as I live, because you were this big, husky guy. And here I'm this kind of a tall, but on the other hand, skinny as a pole guy. And I'm talking to you as, you reminded me of kind of a Joe Louis almost in terms
Changed a lot over the years.
the way you were. And so I had a big impression. My first reaction is, wow, this guy is really something good. And as a result, that initiated an interaction between the two of us. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then go on and tell us some of the important things that you felt you've done and accomplished in your life.
Well, I had a number of experiences, and I think that I first owe a great deal of honor to the Lord, who has certainly guided my experiences. I think he has made a difference. And then he gave me a mother that was very much concerned. She was a country school teacher, and just as you say, you grew up in a poor neighborhood. I did likewise, and learned a lot from hard knocks. And my father was a provider, but my mother was the one who was concerned about where I was going to progress. In fact, she gave me the middle name Davage because she was very much enthralled by Clark, it wasn't Clark Atlanta then, Clark University, because the president's name there was Davage. And she said I was one day going to be a college president. So,
and you did, Roy, and that's exactly what you did.
Yeah, Carl Hugg used to said, I told him that, and he said, well, why are you going through such a difficult course here? I said, why don't you just get a degree in administrative education and go on and be a college president? I told him I wanted a substantive degree so that I could make a difference in the institution if I was going to lead it.
So what happened then in those early years?
Well, being in your laboratory, I was doing a number of different things that I had never anticipated. One was almost a breakthrough. Well, I guess it was a breakthrough, but we didn't get to the press as fast as another institution did. And this was working with Reserpine. And we found that doses of Reserpine under your instruction caused hypertension, massive hypertension. And this was not expected in something that's a tranquilizer and hypotensive compound in doses that were given therapeutically.
You got it, Roy. When I'll never forget, as long as I live, as you were recording blood pressure, and then I remember getting this Rauwolfia serpentina benth, which is the chemical, as you said, that was being developed as a tranquilizer, as well as an agent that lowers blood pressure. And I'll never forget when you gave it, and I was looking at the blood pressure as you were, and unbelievably, the blood pressure went so high, I couldn't believe it. I said, my God. We later found out, as we studied that further, that it was due to the release of things like adrenaline. You know, when you run fast or whatever, you release adrenaline and norepinephrine. And that's what Reserpine was doing. And as a result, you were the first in the whole world, really, that discovered this phenomena. But then what happened is...
You were very instrumental in that being a teaching moment, because you had indicated that, and oftentimes you're doing work on an experimental process, and you find the data you're getting out is not exactly what you anticipated. You said rather than rebuking your process, you need to ask the question, what am I trying to be told? What is being indicated? And so we looked at it, and you got Dr. Beck and some of his students involved to find out exactly what was going on. We were drawing blood and putting in ice buckets and then running catecholamine tests on it. And
That's right. And in other words, the party line was that Reserpine's supposed to lower blood pressure. Here we're finding nature is telling us, wait a minute, it's increasing blood pressure. And of course, it was due to the catecholamines. And then, as I remember, the group at Harvard beat us too in press. And so I thought, well, since they already wrote it up, we don't need to wrote it up. But on the other hand, I knew, by God, Roy Hudson is the guy that discovered it.
Well, Ed Domino and Roy Hudson.
I gave you the material and I gave you a little push, but you did the work.
Yeah, it was quite an exciting time, and I was able to get into research there sooner than in zoology, and I'd finished by that time all of my coursework, and I'd done the languages, and we were talking, and you invited me to come as a graduate student in pharmacology, which would have meant that I needed to start all over again and get into classes of 200 or 300, and I said this was a big decision to make, but it was the best decision I'd ever made. Second to choosing a wife.
Well, that's always the first and most important decision of all.
Yes, she's been very, very supportive over 60 years as of August 31st.
Well, it's been more, basically seeing you, your career, you know, from the valley climbing the mountain, and pretty soon you're at the peak, and I'm looking up, and I said, wow, I knew this guy when he was a student.
Oh, I don't think you're looking up. That's sort of a biased statement, but I have very much appreciated the support, and in fact, in the book that you had me write a chapter in, there's a picture of you at my inauguration as the president of Hampton University. You took time out to come down during the time of the inauguration.
Yeah, tell us about that. What you were at Michigan, and then what happened from Michigan? How'd you end up being a president of a university?
I was a Danforth Fellow when I was an undergraduate. The Danforth Foundation had established 50 scholarships that they would give nationwide. All schools could compete, the Harvards, the Yales, the Princeton. My undergraduate school was Livingstone College, and about 500 or 600 students at the time. and maybe one or two PhDs on the faculty. And my wife encouraged me to apply, and my major professor there insisted that I do. And I thought it was a waste of my time, but they insisted, so I went along with it. I was chosen to be one of the 350 to be interviewed after all of the 3,000 or so applications came in. And out of the 350, 50 would be selected. And I was interviewed, and that's a long story in itself that I won't tell. But I ended up going into Durham with clothes where I had to sit on the floor in the bus. All I was red mud all over, and I found a place, a dry cleaner, that allowed me to take a shower and get my clothes cleaned, and got me down to Durham. But I couldn't go at that time. I was not able to go into the hotel where the interviews were occurring, and the director came down himself and interceded and took me up on the elevator for the interview. This was due to the segregation laws in the country at that time. And lo and behold, at the time of the selection, they were unable to reduce the number to 50. They named 54, and of the 54, 3 were black. And one of the black was, he became president of Tuskegee University, and the other was a professor in one of the major institutions in Romantic languages. And I came to Michigan in zoology and ultimately met you, and from there I went to Brown. And at Brown there was another Danforth fellow who was graduate of, who was a Danforth fellow, and he invited me to come to Brown because they were developing a new medical school. Rhode Island had only had one medical school in its history, and it was stopped prior to the Civil War, and they wanted to reinstitute that school, and they wanted to look at medicine from a holistic approach, since all systems work together, and they cannot be effectively studied necessarily in isolation unless you're able to put them back together. And he invited me to interview with the people at Brown, and I did, and was offered a job, a dual role of assistant dean of the graduate school and assistant dean of the assistant professor in the medical school. And Dr. Sievers countered with an assistant deanship in the medical school, but I said I wanted to see how the whole university operated. And
Well, that's interesting because Dr. Sievers was the professor here in pharmacology at the University of Michigan. And as I remember, he really wanted to have you continue here, and it was a big loss for our school, but a gain for Brown. And then from Brown, wow, did you take off? So why don't you tell us what happened there?
It was very difficult to leave Dr. Sievers because he had been very good in terms of his hiring, and I've just found out from the graduate school that I was the first black professor and the first black student to receive the Ph.D. from the University of Michigan in pharmacology. From then, as you say, I went to Brown, and out of Brown, somehow I was found and invited to participate in the in selection of the president at Hampton. Hampton was one of the oldest black institutions, an excellent institution, and remains so today. And in the competition there, I came down to 3 people, and those 3 I did receive the appointment to Hampton, but Elias Blake became president at Clark University, and Cheek became president at Morgan State University. So those 3 people went on as well.
But then you went on and you became a president of another college. Why don't you tell us that story?
I was president of my undergraduate school, and that was a very interesting opportunity because I wanted to go back to see what I could do in terms of attracting funds and stimulating students in terms of their interest and forward look and proper selections. And I was able to go there. I came out of retirement to do that. And out of Brown, I served on, out of Livingstone, I served on a number of corporate boards and federal boards and college boards. And one of them, Park Davis, invited me to consider coming to work for Park Davis here.
And that was here in Ann Arbor.
I was here in Ann Arbor, and you again interceded to get me a visiting professorship here back in the department again.
Well, we were lucky to have you, by God, because obviously you were at the top of the academic ladder in terms of your accomplishments there as well. I recall you as a rather tough, demanding then professor, where you demanded of your students that they shape up and they really pay attention and do well.
Well, you were a similar type of mentor to, in fact, I can remember your saying to love what it is you do, and you said, if I were not being paid, I'd still be doing the same thing. I'd do pharmacology if I weren't paid for it. And it still shows today at 91, you're still into pharmacology.
Yeah, and still doing it and not being paid, I might add. But in any event, then tell us in terms of what are the lessons of life and from an academic point of view and career point of view, can you give us? I mean, are there any high points that you'd like to mention in particular?
Well, I'd say, first of all, one, as you said, needs to love, need to have a passion for what it is you choose to do, so that if you don't get a job right off, I think right away, back in the 60s when we landed on the moon in 1969, there was a number of people who started going into engineering, so much so until there were not many jobs. So there were a number of Ph.D.s in engineering driving taxi cabs. So if you don't like engineering, you end up in a job you don't like, you have a profession you don't like, and you're a bitter person. But if you are still doing something you love, there still is that passion. So that, I think, is extremely important to make that kind of selection. I used to tell my students to work as if everything depends on God, and to pray as if to work as if everything depends on you, and to pray as if everything depends on God. And likewise, I think you have to, in this process, recognize that you're human and there needs to be a balance. You need other people, and there is, we are tripartite individuals. We are body, soul, and spirit. And soul is divided into the intellect, the emotion, and the will. While that is what you are developing in terms of your academics, you don't want to forget your body and your spirit. And so that there needs to be a balance. And for me, my mother was very religious, and I rely as well on the Lord in terms of any progress that I might perceive that I made. I do it in the sense of bringing glory to Him. But we need to think of others and what we're doing with our lives. Life is precious. And there's a poem, and I won't try to recite it all, but is that today is the beginning of a new day, and what I do with this day is going to be extremely important because I'm spending a day of my life to do it. I want it to be worth something, so that it includes others other than just myself. I can't be inward but outward in concern, and my concerns cannot just be about me, but to be about others as well.
In any event, we're now at the point that you've done your share of academic activities. I know you became very prominent. In fact, I think you're one of a thousand people that were selected by Ebony magazine as the outstanding contributors as well.
It was 50. He used the top 50 black executives that Ebony had chosen. And because fortunately I've wound up on the cover of a number of these type magazines and with stories there. And these have been very useful to others, and not just African Americans, but other students who are meeting similar channels or challenges. We had the opportunity to go in. I led a group of 13 black presidents in to have a conference with Nixon about funding for HBCUs, historically black colleges, that were going to lose about $35.5 million the next day if we hadn't gotten in to talk with him. And he said he only had 30 minutes to talk with us. Well, I was selected as a spokesman of the group. I spoke to him for 30 minutes, and he stayed on an hour after that answering questions. So that hit the front page of the Chronicle, and it was a real positive experience. And there were several interviews then after that.
And by God, you got the money. It
We
wasn't
got-
that much,
we
but,
got
but
the
it was
money.
plenty. It's for
Yes,
plenty.
yes.
And you were one of 50 then, not. And I
One
didn't
of
know
50 is a black executive,
Yeah.
yes, in the nation.
Well,
yeah, one
that's
of 50.
fantastic.
Yes.
So then, what happened after that? Now I know you've been in academia. You've had experiences in universities all the way up to presidencies, etc. You're doing all of these wonderful things, and now you start getting involved with the commercial aspects of pharmacology, and that's pharmaceutical industry. Why don't you tell us some of those experiences that you had, and what are the lessons, and in fact, that you've learned that you could tell us some of the stories in that regard?
Well, pharmaceutical industry is a bit quite different from academia. Not so much in terms of what is required in the sense of knowing what it is you're doing and the ethics that is involved. I was very pleased about finding that I worked for the Upjohn Company, Park Davis, and then Warner Lambert Park Davis, all very, very ethical companies. But things can change overnight. You can come in one day and find that because certain things have happened, you no longer have a job. I remember I was in charge of the whole European theater. I ran a lab out of England, and they had hired two Ph.D.s, and 3 weeks before, and found that something occurred, and they were going to have to be released. And I was then dubbed as the person to go down and tell them. And this is a very difficult charge because one of them had just bought a house, and a lot of things involved, and you're looking for safety nets, and sometimes they're not there. And it opens up channels of some of the bitterness of life, since it isn't all beautiful, and you have to learn how to cope with those kinds of conditions, and be concerned about humans, and rather than they're fragile beings, and can meet some situations that are just beyond our retrieval. And it's hurtful sometimes.
Now, you were vice president both at Warner Lambert Park Davis, and then, as I understand it, even then later, you were also vice president at the Upjohn Company.
Yes, I first was director of their central nervous system diseases research, and from there I went to the vice president of their European theater, And then I became a corporate officer of the company and came back to the States and ran worldwide through our public affairs offices, all of our interactions concerned with effects of our compounds around the country and how they impacted people, and particularly when when suits might have been brought, excuse me, and we had to go to court with regard to that. People taking compounds other than in ways indicated in the label and then wanting to sue you for it.
So it was a real a challenge for you in
Yes.
terms of the things that you had to deal with. So, and given a choice, would you say academia versus then industry, or a little bit of everything? Because
Well, I used to be asked, I told them, I'm an academician. I'm an academic person. Even in industry, I indicated that I'm an academic person. I belong on a campus, even though I spent many years in industry. I spent 16 years in industry and about 28 years in academia. Well, no, 22 years in academia.
right, we're very fortunate to have with us a senior medical student. Her name is May Hamidan. May, I wonder if you could talk to Dr. Hudson and ask him whatever questions you wish.
Okay.
Well, it's great to meet you.
It's wonderful meeting you. Thank you so much for coming. It's been such a privilege hearing about everything that you've done throughout your career, and I was just wondering if I could ask you, what decisions did you make that you feel led you towards this skyrocketing trajectory?
Well, you know, if you look in retrospect, sometimes it looks like skyrocketing, and I suppose I could paint a picture of indicating that this is the way I planned it. You know, I went here and here and here. But it wasn't. I didn't do any planning. My mother did a lot of praying, and I would get a hold to a problem. And when you are working, if you are really concerned about what it is you're doing and not trying to impress people, sometimes we expend a lot of energy of trying to impress people. And what it is we should do is to think more about where your heart is and what you're doing and how interested in what it is you're doing you are. And you will be seen, and people will come to you, and they will speak to you. So I think it's more of impressing people in that manner by doing what it is you want to do. And I've said many times at Hampton, there were many proposals that came to Hampton to tell us what was good for us. But we had a plan, and we evaluated what came to us. And if someone wanted to give us, say, $1 billion to set up a chicken farm, well, we would not have taken it because a chicken farm was not in our plan. And so they would keep their $1 billion. So you have to make sure what you want to do and not be detracted by something that's not very positive because it's on a silver platter. And so that you think about where you're going and keep your eyes there rather than looking at the periphery.
I'm wondering, Roy, let's say you're now talking to a group of young students of all kinds. And what would you say beyond what you just said in terms of how should these young people develop to achieve whatever they wish to do in life?
Well, the first thing I'd say that you're not an island to yourself.
Oh, I love that.
There are other
You're
people.
only one. We're all a family.
We are family,
And by
and
golly,
we
a
need
big
each
family.
other. And we need each other, and we need to have a sensitivity in terms of what is it I'm about to do, and what if that were going to be done to me? What would be my responses? And so that we are our brother's keeper, and we should function in a world in that manner. Because it's so easy to be a I, me, and my, rather than looking at others and pulling up everyone together.
What would you advise young people a little more? What's the next step?
Well, as I'd say, be true to yourself, and in so doing, try to move the world toward a place where we have. You want to maintain motivation, and when people say equity, equity doesn't mean that you make you make a total level playing field, but you don't inhibit where people are going to go on their own, and allow that to occur, and to give it your all. As Paul said, I've run the course, I finished the course rather, I fought a good fight, and I don't know the quote exactly, but we look to him. Paul was quite a philosopher. In fact, I think he was the first psychiatrist, because he said, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are of good report, and that's not in order, and whatsoever things are lovely, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. Keep a mind full of positive ideas, not just about yourself, but about the world at large. And we live in a world where the haves have 90%, and there are a whole lot of have-nots that have little or nothing, and something should be done about that.